So now, April 11th, all of us have been invited to honor the Father, the theme, the face-to-face. We're going to be with Pastor G Day at Roselle, New Jersey, at his house, Agape House of Worship. We are going to discuss, you can see the schedule. We'll start Friday, April 12th, and then we'll end Saturday, April 13th at noon. And the times I've been to these tables are usually around a book. We've done a book of Galatians. We've done different talks. And it has been absolutely incredible, the depth of conversation, the different things that that people shared, the relationship, eating together. I want to encourage you, if you are at all able, April 11th and 12th, to be able to connect and to come to Pastor G Day's house to see the network in person, it will be worth it. And you can get the prices from everything. You hit the register today button. This is the ChristCovenantCoalition.com website, and you can see the prices right there. And you can register, and it's really close to the airport. I believe it's about a 15-minute drive from the airport. It's not far at all. And so if any of you have any questions, you can text Bishop Joe, email in. We will be able to answer all that and get you hooked up. Okay. So with all this being said, finally, I believe we're to the point where I can turn it over to Marc Estes. He is a pastor of Manna House. He's been there for 28 years in Portland, I believe, sir. And he, I believe that church was started by Dick Iverson and Frank Damasio, for some of you to begin to give it context. He's also one of the directors or leaders there at Portland Bible College. And I'm a father in the faith. He's an apostolic father with a network across the world that does church planting and numerous things. And so without any further ado, I want to just honor and welcome Mr. Marc Estes. So Mr. Marc, if you would, take it away, sir.
Yeah. Hey, good morning, guys. Thank you. I should say good evening to a few of you here, South Africa, but thanks again for your time. And I almost felt with all those technical difficulties that it was Sunday morning and we're dealing with our AVL teams.
Yes, sir.
But that's so good. Hey, first and foremost, I want to life to serving churches and leaders. I know that we all are just very honored and humbled to be a part of his world and his life. And second of all, just want to thank you guys. I know that you don't hear that often enough, but thank you for your dedication, your commitment. Pastoring these days is a very challenging thing. Just want to thank you guys for all that you're doing. I know that each of us probably could get on this call and talk and be experts in any one area. So I come to you alongside of you, trying to share some thoughts and some ideas that I think might help us in this post-pandemic era. And again, we'll have some time at the very end to talk through some thoughts or some ideas and answer some questions. I love the way that the conversation started with AI. I want to kind of end there a little bit without trying to sound too salesy. I'm involved in a company right now that is using AI to help churches reach thousands of people. And it's really exciting to see how we have been able to accelerate reaching people. But what I'd like to do with our time together today is to talk about reaching people in a post-pandemic era. That's kind of the focus that Pastor Joseph wanted me to focus in on. And I think that we're all very, very aware that we're living in very tumultuous times. And if you don't mind, I'm gonna share my screen, and I'm going to, as one would say, hook a fire hose up to your lips. Try to give you as much content as I can. So here's the screen there. If you can see that, be awesome. But, I think that we'd all agree that we're living in tumultuous times, and I would say that everything that can be shaken is being shaken. And it's interesting to see that as God is pouring out his spirit upon the church and as the church is being revived, it's in those times and seasons where we really begin to see the world being awakened. And those things throughout history, when we're on the crest of a great awakening, we can always see increased uncertainty in culture as well as increased outpouring upon the church. And I think we're in one of those seasons. I think we're on the crest of one of the greatest awakenings in our nation and perhaps globally. And we look at, the political battles and the moral decline and the financial uncertainties and racial tensions and global wars. And it's very evident that people are being unsettled. They're filled with fear and anxiety and depression. And what's happening, and I want you to see this, and again, I'm going to be focusing a lot on USA statistics, but you have to know that these are transcending globally. I was just in Brazil. I was just in Japan. I'm on my way to Cambodia. And we're seeing a lot of these same things in different nations. So I do apologize in advance if I'm focusing specifically on United States statistics, but I do think that they transfer over. But here's what we're finding if you look at this particular graph on the screen. Since the pandemic, we're finding that 74% of people say that they feel more spiritually hungry now than prior to the pandemic. In fact, a lot of people are saying, or studies are showing that people are more open to the gospel now since the Jesus People movement. And it's in times like this, again, with all of the noise and everything going on, that we've just got to stop and come back and recognize that God's up to something, that it's not church as usual, it's not business as usual. We need to discern the times and seasons in which we live. As Jesus said, we can't afford to miss the day of our visitation. And so with this in mind, I think that there's an opportunity for us in the midst of everything that's going on, and as we're trying to rebuild our churches in a post-pandemic era, that we don't lose sight of the fact that there is a harvest that is ripe and ready. And so I want to kind of focus on this thought about being a gospel-centered leader and building gospel-centered churches. And when I think about a gospel-centered leader, it simply is this. It has everything to do with, and it should be on the screen here. My computer wants to go slow on me. I apologize. There we go. I have a definition up there for you, and it's a gospel-centered leader is one who does not allow the challenges, trials, and tragedies that surround them to affect the unwavering conviction to be a catalyst for the gospel in their church, culture, and world. And, I've always said, so goes the leader, so goes the church, right? What you focus in on, what's in your heart, is going to be in the heart of your people. What you preach is what they eat. And it's so important to understand this. But sadly, what's happened in this post-pandemic era is the pressures, the challenges that have come upon us have affected the way that we see things outside the walls of our church. And it's important for us, as we look at this diagram, to recognize that we need to have the right perspective. And as I work with churches all over this nation and world, I have found post-pandemic that leaders, unfortunately, fall into one of these three categories, the majority of them. They're either increasingly becoming a separatist, filled with fear and self-preservation. It's kind of this idea of let's don't mingle with this icky, evil world. And there's a lot of that going on right now. There's another category, which I would call conformists, and those are those that they just want to blend in and vanish into current culture. And we see entire denominations changing their theology around things such as sexual orientation, just simply because they want to love, but they're not necessarily really leaning into this idea of being counterculture or being the truth. And then there's a whole group of people, which I would call antagonists. And these are people that want to stand for the truth, but they become arrogant, they become hostile. They just want to be right. And they're even willing to sacrifice their reputation with the harvest in order to just be right. And I'll say it this way, they care more about being right than fulfilling their purpose in reaching those that are unlike them. And really, where I want to go today and talk about this is that We need to be a different kind of leader. Post-pandemic era, we need to be gospel-centered kingdom ambassadors. And again, if we can get that into our heart and spirit and begin to ask the Lord to really fill our hearts and our lives, what begins to happen, as we all know, is that our leaders, our eldership, our boards, our teams begin to be more gospel-centered, which ultimately produces a gospel-centered church. And this is really where I believe the Lord is speaking to us in this day and this age, is that we build churches that are fully committed to build the church that Jesus had in mind. And I just want to say that they understand that their mission is his mission. Jesus, 128 out of 199 times, was involved in gospel situations. 66% of his ministry was involved in reaching the lost. And again, our statistics or our ratios are far from that. But what we see as we look at, obviously, the Gospels, we look at the book of Acts, we look at the epistles, we find kind of these two predominant things arise. I think we all agree with them. The challenge isn't that we don't agree. The challenge is, are we actually implementing them? Come on. And it's, reaching lost people and making disciples. And what's happened is we look at this cultural shift, I call it a tectonic shift, is that, as Dorothy the Wizard of Oz once said, we're not in Kansas anymore. But if we go back and we look at the previous generation, and again, this has been a slow bleed, but it has been accelerated significantly in the last 3 to 5 years. And what we saw previously in a previous generation is this idea that faith was in the middle of family, vocation, education, politics, which allowed us to lead and to evangelize very differently. We are now, I know in Portland, I feel like I'm in Babylon, because what's happened very quickly is faith has been removed from the core of these 4 foundations. And we have to recognize what this has done. It's radically shifted the mindset of the harvest, because faith has been removed out of the core, meaning that the influence that has come upon people in the educational arenas or political arenas is far absent, meaning they're drinking a different kind of Kool-Aid, right? And so when we go and we look at this post-pandemic era, and some of the things that we've been studying and looking at is that prior to the pandemic, what we found is that it took about 3 to 5 connect points with someone outside of the church to get them to walk through the doors of your church. This could have been an invite, it could have been a text, an email, a social media post, direct mail flyer, but people, it was about 3 to 5 contacts before they go, okay, I think I want to enter the door of a church to find out about what this actually represents, this thing called Jesus or church. Post-pandemic, this is a tectonic shift. There's now 12 to 15 connect points before someone walks through the door of a church. And people are becoming much more reclusive. They're depressed. They're skeptical. They're fearful. And what's happened is, and again, if you're a senior pastor, you got to hear this. Most churches today don't have a 15-point strategy to connect with churches to get them to walk through the door. We might have some kind of a lead or a connection with someone, and so we might send an email or a text, and then next week there's a whole new batch, and we've only touched people 3 or 4 times. When they're sitting there feeling very reluctant and skeptical and isolated, and what they simply want to know is, do they matter? Do you see their needs? And are you willing to walk with them in their journey as they feel very skeptical and nervous to enter into any kind of faith journey? And this is significant shift for us to understand. And so as we move in, I'm going to do this section pretty quickly here, but as I think about being a gospel-centered church, there's some core elements that we need to recognize and go back to our teams and talk about. Like the first thing we need to understand is have a gospel-centered understanding. Take a retreat, spend some time and say, what do we actually believe? What's our theology? What's the Bible say about reaching people? Like let's look at God's design and follow that. We need to talk about how that then applies to our gospel-centered vision. Like, where are we going? Like, everything that we do must be directed towards fulfilling our God-given mandate, our services, ministry, events, budgets. We should be looking at every area and say, is everything that we are doing have some kind of a gospel flavor or tone to it? That doesn't mean that we don't pastor and that we don't care, that we don't counsel. But again, the end goal, like when I look at our children's ministry, the end goal of our children's ministry is not to raise godly kids. It's to raise godly kids who have a passion for lost people and go out and reach them and then teach them to in turn do likewise. And so this whole mentality has to be embedded in everything that we do with our vision. You know, our gospel-centered mission, like, why do we exist? Why are we sucking air on planet Earth? And we need to let the world around us know that there's a God that loves them, you know? And then it really comes down to the idea of gospel-centered focus. Like, and this is really the true report card. Like, where are we devoting our time, our talents, and our treasures? I think we need to get back to preaching a gospel of go and tell, not just a gospel of come and see. And I think this is really important because people just are not driving by wanting to go by your church. And so when we look at that, we've got to recognize that the people around us, and this is kind of where I want to hone in on, is that the people that are around us are becoming increasingly different than us. And it's our responsibility to discern and understand culture and to adapt our message to them, not necessarily require them to understand our message. And this is so important. And so what I want to do is just quickly look at this particular quote by Carl F. Henry, a great theologian. He said, the gospel must be appealing to those who need it, not just to those who speak it. I love that quote. That's a real challenge for us of how are we now contextualizing our message to the people around us. And so I want to look at this scripture. And again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but you know, Paul's addressing the Corinthian culture, the Corinthian church, and he's trying to help them understand, like, how should we be contextualizing the gospel to a world that is very different from us. And if there was ever a scripture that applies to today, it would be this portion of scripture in 1 Corinthians 9. We recognize that there's this insurgence of Roman colonists that's come in, pagan beliefs, behaviors, cultural nuances have taken place. You know, we recognize that Corinthian was the center of science and culture and arts and commerce and entertainment and wealth. And with all of that came this escalation of evil and immorality. So Paul's trying to get them to think about how they should be building the church and reaching their region. And he says this, even though I am free man with no master. And I want you to just see these few things here of how many times he talks about how he lives, not how he believes. You'll see 5 times in 5 verses, he says, I live. In other words, I do. I just don't think. I just don't preach. I just don't pray. I live. Second of all, you're going to see that his living was all focused. You see 5 times, bring them to Christ. And this is so critical that we catch this. And he says, even though I am free man with no master, I become a slave to all people, what? To bring many to Christ. When I was with the Jews, I lived like a Jew. Like, we got to just grasp what he's saying here. What? To bring the Jews to Christ. When I was with those who followed the Jewish law, I too lived under the law. Even though I'm not subject to the law, I did this so that I could bring them to Christ, so that those who are under the law. When I'm with the Gentiles who do not follow the Jewish law, he says, I too live apart from the law so that I can bring them to Christ. but I do not ignore the law of God. I obey the law of Christ. In other words, unconditional love, uncompromising truth. When I'm with those who are weak, I share their weakness, for I want to bring the weak to Christ. And I love his final statement. Yes, I try to find common ground with everyone, doing everything I can do to save some. And I do everything to spread the good news and share in its blessings. Paul's just helping us understand that we have to discern, we need to understand culture, we need to recognize that they're very different from us, we need to go where they're at, and we need to engage in a significant way if we're going to bring them to Christ. And so I just kind of want to talk about these three things today. I'm going to get really practical and just kind of springboard off of this particular scripture. Like if we're going to reach people in a post-pandemic era, there's three realities that we need to be focused in on. Number one is, where are we at? Like, take an honest report card. Where is the church at? Second of all, we need to take an honest look at, where are they at? Like, what are the cultural realities that we're facing, and not be bothered by it in the sense that we are separatists, but that we recognize that we need to change our approach in order to reach them. And ultimately, how do we then connect the church to culture in hopes of reaching it? And so I want to look at those three things. And this first area is like church realities, to just look at, like, where are we at when it comes to us? Like, let's just stop, forget about culture for a second. Post-pandemic era, where is the church really at? And I'm going to speak of the capital C church. This may not apply to your church, because obviously everyone on this call is not fitting into this category. We're going to talk about all the other churches, if you will. But when we look at this, what we find is that the entire chapter of chapter 9, Paul is dealing with personal liberties and rights. And he's spending a great deal of time helping us to understand that in Christ we have all of these incredible freedoms. Yet despite the freedoms, what he's saying is there might be some freedoms that we need to forfeit in order to eliminate any barriers that might inhibit us from reaching others for Christ. And this is, I think, what Paul was really trying to say. The heart and spirit of this chapter is, your mission is more important than your privileges. I'm going to say it again. Your mission is more important than your privileges. In our cancel culture today, we want to be right. And again, I'm not saying we compromise truth. We want to be right, but it's at the expense of resisting the very culture that God has put in front of us to reach, right? And that's what we see there. He says, I become a slave to all people. In other words, I'm giving up my rights and privileges and freedoms so that all people might be brought to Christ. In other words, I don't want to corner people, but I want to get people in my corner. And what that means is that we've got to change our thinking and our behavior, which is really challenging in a very hostile cancel culture. Andre Crouch said this. He said, if we're going to be effective in connecting culture, we have to start by being brutally honest with ourselves. And I do this with our church and our team, the different churches that we're working with. Like let's ask the hard questions. Like, how are you really connecting with people that don't look like you, that don't vote like you, that don't have the same sexual orientation as you? Like, are you genuinely reaching out? Are you engaged? Do you understand? Do you have empathy for? Do you have compassion for? Like, what are we actually doing? Paul said, I live. How are we living towards the harvest around us? And then we have to ask ourselves, do we really understand? Like, how do they think and how do they behave? I just led a guy to Christ that was a white magic, Calvinist, Catholic, Satanist Jew. Welcome to Portland. And so, I had to get into his world to begin to just understand, like, what is he thinking? What's his history? What's his story? ultimately, it was through that engagement I was able to lead that guy to Christ. And I think those are some challenging questions. But let me just hook a fire hose up to your lips and just state a couple things. And this would be kind of the pulse of what we see where America is at today. First of all, we'll see that every year more than 4,000 churches are closing their doors compared to 1,000 new church starts. That isn't a good report. We see from 2010 to 2020, in one decade, the Protestant denominations in USA declined almost 5 million people, 9.5%, while US population increased 24 million, 11%. This is a staggering 24.5% swing in the faith foundation in just a decade. This is like one of the most rapid declines in the history of our nation. We see the United States now ranks third, following only China and India, to the number of people who are not professing Christians. In other words, we're becoming an ever increasingly unreached people group within itself. We find that half the churches in the United States did not even add any new members to their rank in the last 2 years. That is mind-boggling. We're talking about 50% of churches, and you wonder if the reason why is maybe they're just not gospel-centered. But here's the most staggering to me. 50% of all churches in America did not add one new convert to their church in the last 12 months. You're talking about 180,000 churches. Our brother was just sharing about having 51 salvations since the first of the year. Thank you. That is not the norm in our country. And again, we're talking about where are we really at? Here's some other things that when we just talk about pastors today, 99% believe that they should be sharing the gospel. 89% pastors surveyed said they have zero time reserved on their weekly priorities to share their faith. 84% spend an average of less than 1 hour per month with any unsaved person. 52% say they actually shared the gospel at least once in the past year outside of the pulpit. One time in 1 year, only half of pastors. And only 37% have led a person to Christ within the last 2 years. So when we just stop, and again, obviously this isn't anyone on this call, but when we take a pulse of our church culture, we recognize that we have definitely, we're creating this spiritual DMZ zone. We have become disconnected and unaware of the rapidly changing culture around us. So here's the second thing. Again, I told you we're going to talk about three. Where are we at, the church? And now where is culture at? And so Paul begins to come and talk about this idea in verses 20 through 22, where he begins to unpack this idea of, to the Jew, I became like the Jew, and to the person under the law, like the person of the law, and the Gentiles, and the Gentiles, I became like them and lived apart from the law. What Paul's doing here is he's identifying 4 different kinds of cultural classes, religious or social cultural classes. And what he's trying to say is saying, this is the world around you. And we've got to recognize the variety and the diversity of these different belief systems, different behavioral climates. And we've got to investigate where they are at so that we can become like them, that we might win them. And what you see in this particular scripture, and I'm going to add one, to take the liberty to add one to it. But what I see Paul's addressing, and where we need to go as we look at the world around us today, is recognize these things. First of all, our culture is becoming increasingly pluralistic. Like when we think about the people we're trying to reach, these are people that believe that there are more than one or more kinds of ultimate reality. All beliefs and behaviors are equal and up to the individual person to decide. No absolute truth exists. And so pluralism, not Christianity, now dominates the pulse of American spirituality. In fact, there's 6,000 so-called Christian cults or world religions on our spiritual menu worldwide. I mean, it's bigger than the church cheesecake factory's menu. I mean, there's just like thousands of options for people today. We recognize that people would be considered postmodern, like they deny the existence of any ultimate principles. They lack optimism of there being a scientific, philosophical, or religious truth which explains everything for everybody. Like reason's replaced by emotion, rationalism is replaced with subjectivism. Morality is replaced with relativism. I mean, reality itself is like this social construct. And we look at this whole idea about hierarchy. It's being replaced with cultivating anarchy, So you just go down this list. And again, this is where people are at and what they're thinking. Here's the other reality is that they're post-Christian. I would go as far as saying quickly becoming anti-Christian. And Christianity is no longer the predominant belief system that shapes the morals and the values of this nation. Society continues their quest for spirituality. They're just pursuing other beliefs other than Christianity at a startling rate. I started by saying 74% of people today feel more spiritually open. It isn't necessarily Christianity, but we better dive into that space and bring the right gospel. Otherwise, they're just going to find another alternative. The other thing is that they're pessimistic. Like they've lost respect of the church as a whole and have little hope that the church or we as leaders can offer anything of value or worth to their lives or to the future of our nation. And again, we're seeing that pessimism towards the Christian community reigns high right now. Let me say this carefully with a smile on my face. Because of our reaction to what's happening to us and around us. Like, I believe when we go back to George Floyd, we look at what just happened with sanctity of life, the political storm that is facing us, the transgender stuff that we talked about last time I was on the call. Like, God's trying to give us an opportunity to dive into this space where culture is asking questions, not resist it, not condemn it, but to dive into it and to bring light to that dark space. And that's why people feel pessimistic today, is because every time there's another cultural tension, we speak against it, we put it down, we condemn it, but we're not coming like Jesus in John 8 with the prostitute in the dirt and just getting into the dirt, getting into their space and walking with them through their confusion, if you will. And so as we look at statistics, and I won't do a 42% of people today believe that faith is actually a problem for society today. 60% of people in America believe that trying to convert another person to Christ is actually extremism. And 50% of people are saying that praying for someone in public is totally unacceptable. Like, that's crazy. And you start looking at it, if you were to read the book put out by Dave Kinnaman, Unchristian, he'd say 87% of unchurched people think that we're judgmental, 85% say we're hypocritical, 75% say that we're too political, 78% say we're old-fashioned, 72% say we're out of touch with reality, 70% say we're out or insensitive to others, and 68% we're just flat out boring. And so, like, this is so critical for us. Like, these are the people we're trying to reach. And like our pre-pandemic methods, strategies aren't going to work. We came out of the pandemic, and unfortunately, what happened with so many in church today is they just went back and picking up their old means and ways of trying to reach people. It's no wonder that the average attendance in church today in America has dropped 20% in 3 years. It's because we just simply have not recognized the absolute radical shift that has taken place in just a short time. And so I want to kind of focus here, and I've taken the liberty to add this particular point. And again, our conversation started this way, and I'd love to do a whole session on this as a pastor of how are we using our digitally driven strategies. But let me just say this. This is where people are at. They're not coming through the doors of your church. The average person is spending 9.25 hours on their smartphone a day. The platforms where people are engaging now are not the core five. It's not just Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. There's 72 different platforms right now. So we've got to recognize that there are people all over the place. Voice recognition technology has taken center stage. 98% of churches, if I was to pick up the phone right around you and say, find a church near me, 98% of churches don't show up. And the majority of people are using that one strategy to reach or to find a church around them, at least those that are spiritually open. Maps are becoming a primary search tool over Google itself. AI, and again, here's where we could spend a lot of time, I believe has become the greatest potential tool given to the church to reach seekers and behaviors. So the company that I'm working with right now is we're spending a great deal of time using AI to build personas for churches and then to go out and reach people within a 15-mile drive range to identify people, not only just demographically, but psychographically, that are either new to the area looking for church on a spiritual journey, and targeting those people with nurture point conversations that we can begin a dialogue to get through 12 to 15 connect points with them to just begin to build that conversation so that we can begin to draw them into a relationship with Christ. And so we just got to recognize that this is a big part. All that being said, and I'm going to try to do this last section quickly, and then we'll jump into some questions. So if we recognize where the church is at, and we recognize where society's at, like how do we remove the spiritual DMZ zone? Like what's happened in the last 3 years is there's been this DMZ zone that has been created, even though we have the desire to reach. What's happened is with our busyness, preoccupation, all of our challenges in the world with all of its fears, we've just created this colossal divide. And so what Paul is saying is this. He's saying, I'm going to try to find common ground. Like I need to contextualize the gospel. I need to engage in all of these complex sectors of society. I've got to find common ground. And I love what he says, with everyone. Again, people that don't look like you, vote like you, have a marriage different than you, have a belief system different than you. Everyone doing what? Everything I can to save some. And so with that, I just want to talk, and I'm going to do this really quickly here, but here's some kind of takeaways. We could spend a whole session just on these. The first one is this, is build relationships. Like transforming culture begins with connecting to people in culture. Paul spent 54% of his time in culture, not in the temple, in culture. He was on missionary journeys and town squares, engaged with people of all races and walks of life. Again, Jesus, 66% of his ministry was in the culture itself. And so if we're going to do that, we need to, first of all, and again, I'm just going to encourage you with this, is not just preach on this, but make a shift in the church to say, we're going to go back to equipping. Ephesians 4, equip the saints for work of ministry. We need to equip our people to reach their relatives, friends, neighbors, and coworkers. And statistics show that 86% of all people that ever get saved and come into the church that have a relationship inside the church will actually stay. And so again, we spend a lot of time, and I'm all for any kind of evangelism. But again, we spend a lot of time doing public evangelism or outreach with strangers, but we're just not taking the time to mobilize our church around relationships. And so I think it's something that we need to get back to is it's just the one-on-one idea of relationship with relatives, friends, neighbors, and coworkers. Teach them how to engage in culture, to be like Daniel in Babylon, right? I do want to mention, I do a seminar, it's called Reach. And I just want to let you know that if you're on this call, you want this handbook, the notes, email me and I'll just give it to you free. Do it for your church, train people. It may not be the best, but it's something. And I've been going out doing this seminar in a lot of churches and really beginning to just practically help churches engage their people. So I really want to encourage you with that. Second of all, I think we need to have a broader proactive strategy. And we talked about, gospel-centered vision and mission and where do we spend our time, talents, and treasures and all those things. But to really sit down and to think about that, but where I really want to encourage you to think about, because I think that you can do many of the other things in a great way. I want you to think about this digital space. And again, we started this conversation with AI, but one of the things that I'm just going to throw out to you unapologetically is something that we've put together. There's 7 of us leaders, national leaders, tech people that have been on the bleeding edge of reaching people using AI in the 72 different digital spaces. And we created a company called Visitor Reach. And again, you can take a peek at it on your own. But basically what Visitor Reach is, it's a revolutionary AI digital outreach and follow-up strategy that seamlessly connects churches with people. We're talking about this DMZ zone, people that are new to your city, people that are seeking a church, or people on a spiritual journey. And so unlike like traditional social media approaches, what we've done, our custom AI church tech services, we leverage all 70 different digital platforms, voice recognition, maps, and we proactively engage with those that are most open. So we're just not blanketing social media with some kind of post looking for likes. We're finding the people that are open and connecting them to you to begin a conversation. And once they connect, and they give you their name, their phone number, their email, they all drop into a particular app. And you can kind of see an idea of what that looks like. If you can text, you can use this product. And it begins this one-on-one personal dialogue. Some people, it may be 50 to 60 texts before they ever walk through the door. And we use AI technology, automated responses, quick replies, live text to begin pastoring people. You might see anywhere from 200 to 300 people a month coming into this particular app, resulting in 20 to 30 people a week walking through the door of your church. And so you begin just pastoring these people. The Father's House out in California, we just launched them, 164 people in 4 days. When we launched our church, 224 people in 13 days. I mean, it really, really is significant. Not only does it open up the front door, but it allows you to proactively pastor the unchurched and close the back door. And so it's just something to consider. So I want to put this up here and then I'm going to go on. And I just want to let you know, here's a QR code. If you're interested in a conversation or a demonstration, I've done this with Pastor Joseph. We'll give you guys a significant discount in what we're trying to do if you just click on that. You can also go to visitorreach.com and you can take a look at that and talk a little bit more about that maybe with your leaders. I'll do these last and then I'm done. I think the second thing that we need to do, and Paul alludes to this, is understand them. We need to realize that we need to understand them without compromising our convictions or our values. But Paul's alluding to this. The responsibility lies on us first to understand them before they can ultimately understand us. The age-old saying, understand before being understood, which means that we need to begin to take a look at our biblical text and then have a cultural context. Like, how do we contextualize the gospel for the gay community? How do we contextualize the gospel for the transgender person? How do we do that for people that would be in a different political arena. Again, we don't want to be right. We want to lead them to Christ. I should say be just right. The next thing we need to do is love them unconditionally. I love where Paul says, to the weak, I become weak. And it's this double connotation, if you will, weak in conscience, also weak in economy, if you will. But Paul's just trying to help us understand that you need to reach out to people, not just because you want to win them, but because you love them. And we need to get back to this idea that we love people unconditionally. Jesus loved to hang out with sinners. We need to do the same too. The whole idea about serving them selflessly. Paul says, I became all things to all people that by all means I might win some for the sake. 4 times he says, I might do all things for all people. And I think the best way really to bring validity back to the gospel these days is simply to serve those that are around us. We could spend a whole conversation about ways that we're doing that. The next one is we need to stand confidently. Chapter 9, verse 23 says, I do this all for the sake of the gospel. Paul goes on, Romans 1:16 says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. And I think, this might sound like a counter thought, but I think it's complementary to what I just said. We need to, again, have unconditional love, but we also need to have uncompromising truth. And so we can't be silent with our truth because the gospel in some ways can be offensive. And so we need to be able to speak the truth, but we need to do it in love. Jesus came full of grace and truth. And it's a blend we really, really need to figure out. And what I have found that is if I've engaged, I've built trust, I've loved these people, I ultimately then have permission to speak the truth that we have. And then lastly is just this, and then we're done here. We can do some conversation, is let's believe for greater opportunities. Pray it, speak it, write it. And as Paul said, let's live it. And I do believe, I want to finish where I started, is I believe that we're living on the crest of one of the greatest awakenings in history. I believe that the Holy Spirit is pouring upon his church in a significant way. And ultimately, I believe that society today is more desperate than ever. And this is our opportunity to shine. And we will win the culture around us if we can understand them and engage in the way that we're called to engage. So with that in mind, I'm just going to open it up. I wanted to say Joseph because I see the name under. I'll just open it up to you guys.